Good evening, folks. My name is Jan Carson. I'm a writer based in East Belfast, and I'm really excited to be introducing this evening's event at Belfast International Arts Festival. Before I get going, can I acknowledge that this event is running in partnership with Westival, and we want to offer special thanks to the Department for Foreign Affairs of the Government of Ireland for their generous support of this event. And what an event it is. Helen Lewis is with us this evening. Helen is no stranger to anybody who listens to their radio or reads papers, or I've come across her quite a few times in the last few years, and I'm so excited to hear her talking about her new book, Difficult Women, A History of Feminism in 11 Fights. She's going to be hosted tonight by Ailbhe Smyth, and I'm sure it's going to be an absolutely wonderful way to spend your evening. Obviously, we'd all rather be together in the same room, but this is a great alternative and a way to get some thought-provoking things to think about for the next wee while. If you enjoy this evening's event, the book is available in person or online at No Alibis, where David and his team will be happy to help you out and recommend other books around the topic. If you're listening along in Westport, you can pop into Tertulia Bookshop and they'll be equally happy to help you out with some books. If you've enjoyed the event tonight and would like to find out about some other things at the Belfast Festival, please check out our website, www.belfastinternationalartsfestival.com. For now, I'm going to get a glass of wine on the go and put my feet up and listen along to Helen and Ailbhe. Enjoy your evening.
Hi everybody, I'm Ailbhe Smyth and I am absolutely delighted to be here at the Belfast International Arts Festival talking with wonderful writer Helen Lewis, whose book Difficult Women, A History of Feminism in 11 Fights. Mind you, I would have said 22, but there you go, it's one book. So it really is a great pleasure for me. I am from Dublin and I am a very, very long time, probably sort of known as a veteran now, feminist, LGBT and socialist campaigner. And most recently, I've been involved in the struggles for marriage equality and abortion, which have kind of marked our politics north and south over the past few years. And I'm going to ask Helen to give us a few words of introduction to herself, and then
me and the book. Yeah, well, so as you said, Difficult Women is my first book, and in my day job I'm a staff writer at the Atlantic magazine in London. I was formerly deputy editor of the New Statesman, and I worked, well, I was going to say I was honorary writing fellow at Oxford University, but that feels odd to single out someone because I spent so many university libraries researching this book. We can talk about the research process a bit later maybe.
Yes, well, I think that's actually a really important point, because what struck me so forcibly when I was reading the book was it's very substantial, it's very thoroughly researched, there's lots and lots of fascinating, important and interesting detail, but at the same time it's really lively, very kind of high energy, it moves at an absolutely cracking pace all the way through, a great deal of material. And let me say to our listeners, watchers, it's also very witty and at times absolutely irreverent. I strongly recommend the footnotes, they're brilliant. But you know, and you cover such an amazing amount of material, mainly about feminism in the UK, mainly 20th century, or those as a foray back to the wonderful Lady Caroline Norton and her fight for divorce in the mid-19th century. And you covered then a whole host of topics: the vote, education, sex, which is an incredible chapter, work, sport, lesbian struggle. There's a brilliant, fascinating section on time, which I felt was incredibly relevant and pertinent given our understanding of time during the pandemic, which is of course still ongoing. And last but not least at all, you talk about abortion. Oh, and there's a final section on the right to be a difficult woman. You know, I would think that most of us who are difficult were kind of born that way to some extent and developed our potential as we went along. But it's a really great, interesting chapter on feminism now, basically. And then there's a very handy manifesto for the difficult woman as well. Who, for example, refuses to be dismissed because she has grey hair. And then there are some of us like me who just simply refuse to have grey hair at all. But you do say at the beginning, and you come back to it at the end, that, I'm quoting you now, this is a partial, imperfect, personal history of feminism. So I wanted to start off by asking you what motivated you, what galvanized you to write this book, because it does feel, it has that passion of the person very much in it.
Well, I've been writing about feminism for about 10 years by the time that I started on this. And so I felt I was pretty much, hopefully, across the subject. But also it came from a kind of sense of almost depression, really, about, I started writing it in 2017. And that had been, you know, as a political journalist, a pretty brutal time to report on politics, all the way through the EU referendum, all the way through the American election of 2016. You know, it felt pretty vicious and divisive. And actually, it felt like the world was quite a bleak place, you know, that things that we'd taken for granted were going into reverse. And then I kind of thought, well, hang on a minute, let's not get too gloomy here, because feminism's story is, if anything else, one of incredible triumph. And I think it's, you know, it's something that actually it's worth acknowledging, that 150 years ago, women couldn't go to university, you know, couldn't own property in the mid-19th century. You know, women didn't have the vote 100 years ago. You know, equal pay is 50 years old this year. So, you know, these are a series of pretty big things that you would think would be very hard to argue for, very hard to convince the people that you needed to convince to let you have these markers. And feminism did it. You know, I think in terms of social movements you want to learn from, feminism is absolutely right up there at the top.
Yeah, so I mean, I was thinking personally too, though, because you do write about some of your own experiences. And I wonder to what extent that was part of that motivation, that galvanizing.
I think it's definitely part of it. And I think it always is for feminism, because I think the reason that women come to feminism very largely isn't kind of some arid intellectual exercise. It's because something has happened in their lives that they've just thought, why am I expected to put up with this? You know, that isn't right. Whether it's access to abortion services, whether or not it's being a single mum, whether or not, you know, any of these things. You know, whether or not it's minor irritations, like the fact I was just on a running website this morning, which has got running gear and women's running gear, and you just think, well, hang on a minute, why is the world designed around men? And I think that for lots and lots of women, just it's that sense of click. Oh, right, I'm not the only one that's annoyed about this. This is a legitimate grievance that brings them to feminism. So, you know, I write in the book about my divorce, for example, which was, as divorces go, about as good as it could have been. But it really made me realize how difficult to go through that process with children, to go through that process when you don't have an income of your own because you haven't been working, to go through that process with a partner who controls your finances or tries to control access to your children. You know, that actually there is a huge amount that binds women together, for all that we're very different. And I think that is the bit I don't, you know, I think that people recognize something of themselves in great feminist texts, and so I wanted to put myself in there too and say, you know, so I've had these experiences as well.
Yes, well, I mean, and I think for so many of us, what you're saying is absolutely right. And I think about the generational differences between yourself and myself. And as I was reading the book, I was thinking, well, so much of this, not all of it, but so much of it, I could say that is the history of my personal trajectory through life and the kind of the fights and the struggles. And I suspect that it's that way for a great many women, whether they actually identify as feminist or not, in a way, sort of isn't the question. I mean, it was really interesting, I thought, that you started off with the story of Lady Caroline Norton, because around divorce and how, you know, she fought for reform. Well, she fought basically for proper divorce legislation in Britain, but because it did actually seem to me that she summarized, or she kind of resumes the basic premise of your book, which is a really clever and important one, I think, which is that women can often be feminist pioneers, are often very difficult, but that doesn't mean that we should scrap them and toss them aside. And I think that was very important. You do describe, you say very well, what you think, you know, why feminist revolutionaries are difficult, and you explain about them being very complicated women and how the lives don't always fit. And you talk, for example, I'm thinking of Mary Stopes,
Wow, yeah. Well, Mary Stopes is, I mean, if you want to talk about people being problematic, then Mary Stopes is really right up there. So she both wrote this incredible track that put lots of women in touch with, for their bodies for the first time. But she was a eugenicist, and there's kind of no getting around that or no explaining that away. And I don't think we actually should and ought to. I think this is the big conversation that we're having about history at the moment. The meta conversation is about, can you admire people, or can you celebrate events without endorsing everything that they did, or whilst maintaining an awareness that they were flawed and they contributed to harm to others. And I think that's really hard, because we have fallen into this idea of history as something not just that you teach children to help them make sense of the present, but about a kind of national story or a human story. And therefore people think that, you know, in order to talk about the story of women's control over their bodies, how do you deal with a figure like Mary Stopes? How do you deal with the fact that all the way through the history of contraception, you have these people who believe it is their right to tell, you know, to decide what kind of people should be allowed to have children. And that's really uncomfortable. And one of the things that you can do in a book is you can say, I admire what Mary Stopes did, but I don't admire Mary Stopes, or, you know, I find this part of her views abhorrent. But the really complicated thing, which is what I kind of tried to get to with the idea of difficult women, is that if these had been nice, people-pleasing women, they probably wouldn't have done the things that they did. And I think the classic example of that is really Emmeline Pankhurst of the suffragettes. You know, she was tyrannical. She ran the Women's Social Political Union like a dictator. She said, you know, this is it. This is the cause. We don't also do Irish Home Rule. We don't also do votes for men, you know, under the age of 30. And, you know, we don't do general left-wing do-goodery. In any case, she was pretty right-wing. But this is it. This is one thing we do. And if you don't like it, ship out. And then later, when they became more and more violent, she said, if you don't like it, ship out. And we find that still very difficult to deal with, because we think that women should be the kind of nannies, the soothers of, you know, bruised knees and bruised egos. And actually, for women to demand that, no, this conversation is about us right now, and I'm not apologizing for that, is still something I think we struggle with.
Well, I think so, obviously, and I think these the accounts of the women that you give us very often, I think, strike fear into the hearts and minds of those of us who've been involved in organising campaigns for decades and thinking, oh my God, am I the nightmare which is on the page here? And I mean, to some extent, you have to say yes, probably, actually. And you're very, very clear about this, and you come back to this at the end about in that section, the right to be difficult, and in the manifesto about what not being nice and not having to be nice and not even thinking about being nice, what that actually involves and what it means. And that the niceness, I think somewhere you call it the tyranny.
Tyranny of niceness, yeah.
Tyranny of niceness, how important it is to escape that. Would you, one of the women, in fact, I found them all absolutely intriguing, including some of those I knew a little bit about. I'm thinking about Selma James, who didn't exactly fall out with the women's move, with feminists, or did she? She was a very complex person, wasn't she?
Yeah, Selma James of Wages for Housework is an incredibly influential activist, in the sense that, you know, Marxism, that analysis of power relations, is absolutely embedded in modern feminist thought, whether or not people feel that they actually have read any Marx, know anything about Marx or Engels at all. You know, the idea of patriarchy, of nuclear families as a, you know, particularly patriarchal unit, all of that comes from Engels and therefore from Marx. And so she was, you know, she was really important and influential. And if you ever see people on the internet having arguments about, you know, privilege and power, you can trace some of that analysis back to the kind of things that, you know, obviously very different, because they were very much class-based, very economics-based, whereas now it's often happening in identity terms. But that injection of that particular idea into the kind of feminist bloodstream comes from Wages for Housework, and I would argue in those Marxist feminists of the 70s. And yet, yeah, as you say, she was not somebody who wanted to kind of share power. She liked having followers, and that's something that you keep finding again and again with these very influential women.
You have a lovely phrase where I think you describe her as being quite happy with the cult of personality.
Right, yeah, and I think that's something that's very hard. If you can see behind me all of my books, I start work on my second book, which is about the ideas of genius. And one of the things that's really interesting in this idea about that visionary CEOs, chief executives, are quite often narcissists, but productive narcissists, because they don't mind being the front man. They don't mind everybody saying how amazing they are. They are quite visionary. They're incredibly charismatic. They bring people with them. And I think you could say the same about a lot of the great feminist leaders. You can't be the shrinking violet that doesn't want to take the credit and just wants to be a foot soldier. You have to somehow become an icon, and the Pankhursts were very, very, very aware of this.
Yes.
Christabel was a very attractive woman, and she knew that this had huge propaganda value, because the anti-suffragette propaganda was basically, look at these, hag-faced witches who want to stamp on your testicles. And she personified the fact that they weren't predominantly much younger women, and she wasn't afraid to use that. And so you do find this thing that, you kind of again and again run into these women who you think you would have been a nightmare to work with. But how is that related to the kind of person who becomes a leader of a social movement? They have to be slightly okay with being a cult leader.
But that is particularly interesting and problematic and difficult within that vast mansion that is feminism, where right since the 1970s, certainly that sort of notion, that cult, probably a myth, that we don't need leaders, that we're actually all in this together, and that it's very much a collective endeavor, which I think it is, and I think it's extremely important. And there was a very, very early paper written by Joe Freeman, I think, on the tyranny of structurelessness, which meant that sort of semi-quasi-anarchist trend has been there as well, which makes us, as practicing feminists, very suspicious of leaders. I mean, how do we sort of balance those things out? I mean, there can be a suspicion of leaders, and yet
I think part of that comes from the fact that a certain type of woman often gets to be the leader, right? It is often the presentable face of feminism, which often means white and middle class and university educated and straight. Actually, another big one, the idea that Betty Friedan talked about, the lavender menace, about the idea that if we have pushed lesbians to the front of the feminist movement, then this will scare off normal respectable people that we need to convince. So I think that's a lot of that worry about leaders comes from a very reasonable feeling that a certain type of person, it finds it much easier to assume that role. But I'd be really interested to hear about your experiences on this, because I think the problem with that much more anarchist, everybody's got at the same level, is that actually a lot of people don't like that. A lot of people like having clearly defined roles and also clearly defined responsibilities, so that they're not, they will give this amount of time and this amount of energy to a cause, and that's all they will do. They don't want to be entirely subsumed by it. But also that a lot of hard work needs to be done. And there is, in social movements, always a kind of person who wants to have an endless discussions about stuff, but doesn't really want to do the very boring door knocking, handing out leaflets, all the tedious stuff of campaigning. And I think that is one of as ever, it is always a balance. You can go full autocrat, and that's very bad. And you can go full anarchist, and actually that is equally ineffective. But you must have found a happy medium.
Well, I mean, I do think it's really important to try to have feminist groupings and organizations that are pretty well as flat as possible and as participatory as possible. But there's absolutely no doubt that if an issue needs to be put on the agenda of the world, the society, whatever it is, I think that, and if it's a difficult issue, that's something that's always been silenced. I mean, there has to be a bit of determination and stubbornness and obstinacy and persistence, and also a kind of a fearlessness, where you're prepared to speak out about something. And that often puts a woman in the space of then being seen as a kind of leader. And I think that probably can be a little bit difficult. But, my own experience is that when it comes to campaigning for very concrete things, like changes in the law, and you speak a little bit about that later on in the end, very, very interestingly and importantly, where you say we need the hard work of economic and legislative reform. And I think that's absolutely true. And when you have concrete aims, you do need women there, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, who are going to take a lead, not necessarily see themselves as leaders involved in leadership, which apparently you can learn, but who are prepared to I won't say swing the axe, actually, because I did just say it, but who are prepared to push things on. But I, just thinking about Selma James really fascinates me, because I actually think that she is quite overlooked, although her work is now coming back into circulation. a bit, I think, with Maria Rosa della Costa. But there is another woman, there are two more I'd really love to ask you particularly to talk about, but just because you were talking about Betty Friedan and that appalling phrase of the lavender menace, which seems to have kind of dogged me throughout my life. And personally, I'm very happy to be a menace, but not lavender, you know. It's sort of get
not a very flattering colour, is it? No.
Well, what about, I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing her name right, that remarkable Labour MP.
Maureen Colquhoun.
Maureen Colquhoun. I mean, she was extraordinary, really, and not well known.
Not well known at all. And actually, I did it. One of the nice things that happened since the book came out. So, just for background, Maureen Colquhoun was elected in February 1974 into the UK Parliament, and then was at the time married mother, and then fell in love with a woman, Babs Todd, who was quite a kind of leading light of the UK lesbian scene, such as it was at the time.
And was already in a relationship with another woman,
Jackie Forster, who was an incredible a campaigner, and had been a BBC, had been a TV reporter, and came out and did this incredible speech in Speaker's Corner saying, "You are looking at a roaring lesbian," which was a very brave thing to do at the end of the late 60s, early 70s.
You say in the book that she stood down off the podium afterwards, and people could see she was shaking.
She was shaking. She was shaking, which is the definition of courage, which is that it's not that you don't feel fear, it's that you feel fear and you do it anyway. And I think that was definitely true about those early lesbian scene of the 70s. About coming out was a massive deal in a way that I think it's very hard for people, even my generation, certainly maybe teenagers now, to understand that it was seen as kind of, you know, career death. You were no longer a respectable person. You were in this kind of underworld at that point. It's very hard to capture that feeling again now, I think. But Maureen fell in love with Babs in the middle of doing this incredible private members bill called the Balance of the Sexes Bill, which she wanted the House of Lords to be 50-50 women, all public boards to be 50-50 women, like very radical. Yes. And she and Babs lived publicly as lesbian. She put Babs as her partner in Who's Who. Sure. And, you know, and she said, I'm not going to be ashamed about it. And she was deselected by the party. Now, ostensibly on the grounds of supporting Enoch Powell, what she'd actually said was, we've got to listen to the things that he's saying because they're resonating with people, which was read as, he's got a point, which is not, in my view, at all what she was saying. And she had a very progressive record, particularly as a councillor. But she was pushed out of public life, and she ended up losing to the Tory candidate in the 1979 election. And it's a period that I'm particularly fascinated by, because you end up with, at the 79 election, Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister, but the overall number of female MPs goes down.
Yes.
And it is that kind of classic thing between the difference between a collective struggle and an individual struggle, and the left wing, right wing kind of split on that. But Maureen is still alive now. She got over coronavirus. She had a birthday last month. And one of the lovely things that happened is that Kezia Dugdale, who was leader of Scottish Labour for a couple of years, who is lesbian, she's, even now, the really shocking thing is that she's dating an SNP MSP. That's not being gay, luckily, as she said, in public life, really no one cares. But the fact that someone from Labour could date someone from the SNP is now seen as quite outre. But she was very moved by the book, and she started writing to Maureen. And I love that, because that's what I had always wanted from the book, was a sense of generational connection with feminism.
Yes, and I mean, you do talk about the importance of the appreciation and the thanks that we owe these women, from whom we benefit so much, whether we like them or not is irrelevant. But one of the things that really struck me about Maureen Colquhoun was that eventually, a few years ago or some time ago, her Labour constituency committee, or whatever they call them, did write to her and say, basically, we're very sorry that you were thrown out. And I don't quite think they said, we're sorry we didn't stand up for you, but more or less. But the Labour Party, qua Labour Party, never has. And you reference Jeremy Corbyn as saying, well, you know, we do have an out MP and his name is whatever. And you think, oh, it's another Andy Murray moment. It's she.
Right.
Was out a long time ago, you know.
Yeah, that was a Jeremy Corbyn thing where he said, you know, Labour's got a proud tradition of campaigning for gay equality, you know, right back to gay MPs like Chris Smyth. And Fair enough for Chris Smyth, who was an out gay minister in the New Labour government of '97. It was still, he came out, but he's the first one to come out voluntarily. Maureen was outed by the Daily Mail when she and Babs had a housewarming party and sent out invitations with 2 women kissing on them. So she didn't have that choice. But I mean, when it happened, she didn't resile from it. She wasn't embarrassed by it. She was quite open about it. But I just thought that is another symbol where she was regarded as embarrassing by the party, even at the time. So she had all these crazy things, like she said, isn't the Duke of Edinburgh a little bit, racist? Not now a particularly controversial opinion. Isn't it mad that railway season tickets are marked with male or female? And now you think, why did anyone need to know that? But also there's lots of things where the world has come round to her, and there are things on which, and still lively disagreements in the feminist movement now. She was very pro full decriminalisation of sex work. She brought a load of sex workers into the House of Commons who were threatening to reveal all of the MPs who used them as clients. So all these things that were regarded as loony left in the 70s and 80s, lots of them are now completely mainstream. I mean, gay marriage being the obvious example, right? That this was considered to be, well, people will never, wear this. And now you have, David Cameron comes out and makes a speech saying, I support gay marriage because I'm a conservative. Yes. And it's a really interesting parable of how much the window of acceptable thought has changed, particularly on gay rights, I would say, in the last 30, 40 years.
Well, there's no doubt. I mean, if you stick around long enough and keep at the issue, things can begin to turn around. But the problem, in a way, or it's not so much a problem, it really is a tragedy, is that people like Maureen Colquhoun then get lost, dropped, abandoned, dismissed along the way, whereas she had another several decades ahead of her as a brilliant legislator, outspoken before her time, and that we lost that. And I have to say that reading that particular chapter, as you were saying, well, nobody gives a second thought about people being lesbian or gay now. Well, yes, maybe, but maybe not,
Right, well,
I'm just thinking my own history. I actually found that chapter, interestingly and very unexpectedly, the one that really moved me deeply when I thought of the hardship and the difficulties and how we're not entirely there yet, and we're not there yet in so many parts of the world, and yet the ship seems to have sailed to some other destination now. And I was thinking, no, we need to bring back that understanding of how hard it has been for women. So I just like to say thank you for bringing her up there. I mean, it's really very important. I did catch a little flick, mind you, in that chapter that parts of the Labour Party wouldn't exactly be your favourite people.
How did you read that? Well, the interesting thing is that I was quite sceptical of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, which made for an interesting couple of years as a political journalist. And one of them being that, I don't think that there's a particularly good gender analysis in that section of the left. For all that people deride now Harriet Harman as, a centrist and a Blairite and whatever, you kind of go, okay, well, show me your record of legislative achievement. Somebody who has not only just things like lobbying for proxy votes for MPs, so actually just making our democratic process itself more amenable to women with caring responsibilities and now men with caring responsibilities, but also in just, the fact was when she joined the Commons, childcare was an absolutely niche issue. And then you get to elections, 2015 election, the parties were outbidding each other on how many hours of free childcare for 2 and 3 year olds. And she has just moved the Labour Party an extraordinary amount, and anyone who wants to say that was easy and that was pushing on an open door should remind themselves that there were 5 or 6 candidates for Labour leader this time, and all of them women apart from one man, and the one man won the Labour leadership. It is not a party that
I thought Harriet should have been going. I mean, I remember her going way back decades ago, and I was struck, reminded me reading your book that, I mean, she really has stayed very true to her feminist principles, and they are that feminism which knows that saying things moderately doesn't mean that you're not actually trying to do something which is really very radical in terms of the way the society works. But, I did want to ask you one question about that chapter with Maureen Colquhoun and Jackie Foster and Babs Todd and all the rest of them. You call it love. And you warn us early on in the fabulous chapter on sex, which has, just for the benefit of our listeners, a great story about Marie Bonaparte, who is the great grandniece of Napoleon, and where she did research.
Quite something, isn't it?
243 women she did.
She basically, for those people who would like the kind of, I would say the semi-PG rated version of this, she couldn't climax through penetration with her husband, who admittedly was gay. But, she was very annoyed about this, and being a kind of self-starting DIY sort of woman, decided to kind of try and find out what it was. And she went and measured a huge number of women to see how far away their clitoris was from their vagina, and discovered that if it's more than the width of a thumb, basically you can't get enough clitoral stimulation as a kind of byproduct of penetrative sex, so it's just not going to happen. And this was, this is happening at the beginning of the 19th century. And the great tragedy being that basically she fell under the influence of Freud, who said, no, there's such a thing as a vaginal orgasm, and actually a proper grown-up woman doesn't need to have clitoral orgasms. It'll all be fine. You just need to kind of stop being so hysterical and deal with it. And she ended up having several operations to have her clitoris moved, which is, I would imagine a terrible idea from a sensation point of view. But I admired her kind of moxie in seeing that there was a problem, and being a very kind of practical sort of woman about it. But the lesbian chapter, I wanted very clearly to differentiate between very sexualized ideas of lesbianism in popular culture and what those 1970s women were trying to do, which was arguing about reorientating their whole lives, and particularly the radicalness of saying we don't need men. We're the women who don't need men, and how challenging that was for people to hear that.
Yes, well, I mean, I did appreciate that very much, because I think in that chapter, the depth of patriarchy and its absolute resistance to women stepping out of any kind of prescribed line comes across very, very, very clearly, so that you do understand that whole political force of lesbianism. There is one other woman I really love you to talk about specifically, and she is a woman whom we all have to admire and thank, but who I find very hard to forgive, and you will know exactly who I mean. And I say that as somebody, I'm chair of Women's Aid here in the South, and Erin Pizzey has been, and she really did alert Britain and effectively large swathes of the world to the desperate, tragic problem of domestic violence. But
I think she, more than anyone else, I mean, that to me is my...
Sorry, you interviewed Erin.
I did, yeah. And it's, in a way, I think that chapter is my favourite chapter, because it is the most symbolic of the book's argument as a whole. So Erin Pizzey, in 1971, founds the first women's refuge. She essentially gets a house from the council in Chiswick, West London, and decides that she's going to open, which is then called a refuge for battered wives. And it's, it's immediately incredibly oversubscribed, and the stories that she hears are appalling. And no one wants to know. It's a private matter, it's just a domestic. It's, it's not something that other people should get involved in. And over the course of the 70s, she is seriously loud about it. She campaigns about it. She opens other refuges. She, Jack Ashley brings in a bill about domestic abuse in which the words are used in the Commons for the first time. And these stories are incredible. And the depth of denying, why, and we hear all those things that you hear now. Why doesn't she report it to the police? Why doesn't she leave? Why doesn't, all of that work that, that had to be done, she was ahead of. So, again, a great do-it-yourself woman, but at the same time, such a complicated figure, both in terms of being, again, as someone else who was very happy with the cult of Erin, but also the way that she then moves away from the feminist movement. And it's interesting you mentioned the kind of my struggles with the left of the Labour Party, because it is a similar process in that she decides that basically feminism has been taken over by people called Artemis and Gladiator, who smell of patchouli and want to ban the bomb. And actually she is she's more an Emmeline Pankhurst. She's actually on I would say in the kind of centre right of politics. She's certainly not left wing, and she gets driven away. And actually where she ends up is with the men's rights movement, saying actually there's no such thing as male violence. Men have been given a really bad hand. There's dysfunctional relationships. And there are women who are addicted to violence, to the physical sensation of it. And, and ends up hanging around with these people who I don't think really care about women at all. I think whatever else you say about Erin, she's got an incredibly big heart. She cared about all those people that she was with, but she's ended up in kind of ideological bed with some very unsavory people, and also making it very hard for the rest of the movement as a result.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I did finish that section thinking, yes, I do absolutely admire her, but I'm not sure I entirely forgive her for moving over. But I think your point about her being essentially right-wing is actually the key one there, that there is this kind of, just as with lesbians and gays and even trans people, there is a kind of expectation that we're all going to be radical and left-wing. And certainly that's not my experience of our multivarious communities. And I think that there needs to be that kind of allowance. But she is very fascinating. I mean, it would be really interesting to think about what might happen to somebody like Erin Pizzey in the social media war world that we actually live in today. And I wanted to ask you a bit about that, because I mean, you there isn't a section on social media per se, but I mean, it is something that is there as a thread along with a couple of other issues that runs through the book. And you do talk yourself quite briefly, but nonetheless, I mean, you do say that you were trashed on social media for expressing perfectly valid opinions that people simply didn't agree with. I mean, and I assume it was kind of a deliberate decision not to do a specific chapter on social media, but what are we to do about it? And about, I know that sounds like such a naive question, but we're so quick to call out and to cancel. I hate that word cancel. I absolutely hate it. It's like, let's wipe out more people. And it's so often women who actually get wiped out. Yeah, I don't want to get started on that. I'd much prefer to hear you getting started on it.
No, I think you're entirely right, because I think one of the things that's very obvious is the double standards. And, you know, there's some things that you could pick apart everybody for, and it's who you choose to pick apart that is very obvious to me. And the same things that, you know, men can say are received with good faith. Oh, that's an interesting contribution to the debate. Oh, a bit provocative, but lots to think about there. When a woman says it, it's read as hostile, as somehow, actually, I can't bear to hear this. It's hurting me to hear this. And I think that is related to, you know, Mary Beard writes brilliantly about this, about the fact that we don't see women as sources of authority, that we see hearing women's voices is still quite difficult for us, that we don't, you know, that men are objective and they've thought about stuff, whereas women are hysterical and irrational and emotional, and that's, you know, that contributes to their loss of authority. And I didn't write a chapter about social media because I was about to say, because in a way I hope it would be a passing fad. I'm not sure that's necessarily true. I think the thing is that's interesting to me is obviously a lot of my experiences of feminism have been through social media. A lot of the great friends that I've made through feminism have been through social media, and I'm wary of being nostalgic about, oh, in the good old days when all this was just fields, it was better. But I think it has become increasingly poisonous, particularly in the last 5 years, as politics itself has become more polarized in both Britain and the US. And a kind of under-recognized aspect of this is the fact that British feminism is so heavily takes place in the shadow of the US. And actually, often the language that it's using is actually imported wholesale from the US when it's not really appropriate. We have our own unique legal situation, policy situation, racial situation. You know, none of that stuff easily plots across. And yet I find student feminists in particular who are incredibly well informed about things that are happening in America. I mean, actually, Northern Ireland being a very, very good example, right? The fact that when I wrote that abortion chapter, abortion was illegal in almost all circumstances in Northern Ireland was not a particularly well-known thing in British feminism, whilst perhaps some of the stuff that was happening in the US was incredibly widely known because it was in the kind of publications that people would read and people they would see talking on social media. So it's a very double-edged sword. It's brilliant for consciousness raising and awareness raising. My worry is that I think actually you can really over-index on how useful it is for people to know about a problem. There's lots of problems in the world. You know, people know about a lot of climate change is a problem. We know, like, you know, it's the evidence is there. It's on fire. The glaciers are melting. The bit that's quite hard is how on earth do you formulate a policy response to that and then get enough people to agree to that policy response to enact it. But, you know, it's that bit, to come back to what we were talking to earlier, that's the hard, boring bit that you have to turn up a lot of wet evenings in the week when you've got other things on. And I entirely subscribe to this idea that lots of particularly graduate middle class, people who seem themselves to being well informed. Being well informed has become a substitute for doing.
Yes.
And I think that's a real criticism of politics that social media is exacerbated. Having lots of the right opinions on Twitter is actually fundamentally less useful to humanity than you volunteering at your local food bank or your local hospital pickup or whatever it might be. But it feels really good and you feel really righteous, and it's not boring.
Well, certainly, I mean, it's very interesting when you talk about sort of things being exported over from the US. I mean, my own experience of campaigning over the past 5 years, which is pretty recent, is that we are very exposed, certainly in the South, and I think this is true of the North as well, to people coming from America, which sounds so naive in itself, and saying, oh, you need to do this, you need to have town hall meetings. And I'm looking at them and saying, yeah, but we don't have town halls. So, it doesn't kind of work. And then saying things like, well, your messaging needs to be this, that, and the other way. I'm looking at them and I'm saying, okay, that messaging clearly hasn't worked for you. What on earth makes you think it's going to work in a European context? So,
I'm astonished by that, by the amount of times that I see, and I've got lots of, I mean, I work for an American publication. I've got lots of friends who are American. The fact that every so often I will see an op-ed in the New York Times about the terribleness of British feminism, and you kind of want to go, excuse me? Actually, I think if you look like the policy list here, there is no federally mandated maternity leave in America. It's extraordinary. Like there's the Supreme Court judgment about not being able to fire people for being gay or transgender. Huge victory in the summer. 10 years old in Britain, where the Equality Act specifically forbids that level of discrimination. And this is what I mean, is that I think sometimes people can be more aware and engaged by American battles. Abortion being a brilliant example, really. I don't think that anyone should come over from America and lecture Irish feminists, because the repeal the 8th referendum was extraordinarily well done, and just in so many ways.
I was doing an interview not very long ago about the repeal the 8th campaign, and the American woman who was interviewing me, I was describing something around our communications, and she said, oh yes, that is a something or another called by something name, and it's very well established. And I said, no, this was something which we developed here in Ireland, and which you may know about now because we developed it here in Ireland. And being really quite taken aback that there was that inability to just see that different campaigns work differently in different places, and that some are actually successful, which is, I would also say, unusual to be so successful. And I am so relieved for women in the North and women in the South that there is now some access to abortion. You wrote that chapter on abortion, obviously, before October last, or it was finished. But you have a postscript about the situation.
I have a postscript. Yeah, I love my postscript, because it's one of those things where I was like, oh, come on, I've just finished writing this. What do you want? And of course, it probably needs another postscript now. But so I went to Derry to interview 3 activists who bought morning after pills on the internet and then handed themselves in.
Can I just interject there and say that you do actually say that, oh, I was a little taken aback and had to revise my opinion about, activists over 25. Yes, let's hear it for activists over 25.
I do dwell on my terrible ageism, that, the fact that I think there's a real problem when we don't, and this is the interesting bit, we don't see older women as radical. Young people are radical. Young people are the ones who want to tear down the system. And you just think, older women, they're the ones who make the sandwiches. They make the tea. They're very sensible. And no, these women were radical, and they were not just that, they were prepared to go to prison for it. They were absolutely prepared.
Kitty, Diana, and Colette.
That's
their names, and celebrate them.
And Goretti Horgan of the campaign over there said to me, when Diana thought she might have to go to prison, she said, well, it'd be a chance to catch up on my reading. That was a great, okay.
Goretti has been a fantastic pro-choice campaigner and involved in many other campaigns for ever since I can remember, actually, going way back to our early campaigns here in the 80s. So she's not just a local campaigner, she's a national figure, actually. She's fantastic.
And what's also interesting to me is the fact that in the case of Diana and Colette, their activism came out of anti-arms dealing activism. They were protests against Raytheon, the arms company, and from that particular, tradition. And they didn't sort of stumble into this. And I talk about the example, you know, of just the fact that we sort of assume that these women aren't radicalized. They don't have a long history of protesting. That they're very sane and sensible. And I think that is a form of ageism, that we just look at older women in a particular way. But yeah, so the wonderful thing was that they did this, and they handed themselves into the police station. There's a great photo of them outside the police station with a very confused looking member of the PSNI. And it's just what happened then was they never got prosecuted.
Yes.
And there had been incidents before where they'd essentially, the police had sort of picked off individual women, one who was reported by her housemates, you know, a mother who'd bought stuff for her daughter. And they took a caution just because they were terrified of what would happen next. And what happened with Kitty Collette and Diana is they said, we're not taking any caution. If you want to prosecute us, go on, prosecute us. Let's see what the world thinks about this.
They went in there with their hands ready for the handcuffs.
I know. They were absolutely prepared, in the best tradition of the suffragettes, to say, I care about this principle so much, I'm willing to be a martyr to it. And that means something. People feel, in a world of, as you say, of infinite tweets, if something's at stake, if you're willing to sacrifice something, that still has a meaning in activism.
Well, you know, I think that action of those three wonderful and really very brave women at the same time has echoes of the pill train in the South in 1971, when a whole bunch of women took the train up to Belfast, which was, you know, a very common thing to do. You went up and you bought spangles and cheaper butter and cheaper clothes and all that kind of thing. It's all kind of reversed a little bit now, but anyway, you go up to Belfast and buy, I think they went up and they somehow or another managed to get condoms and so on and so forth, and came back down again. There are lots of funny stories about women buying condoms when they didn't really incredibly, totally, absolutely know exactly what they were. So one particular story, what size? So, you know, anyway, I draw a veil over the rest of that one. But they came back down and stood in the station in Dublin and said, right, arrest us. We've just done something which is illegal, which is actually a criminal offence. So arrest us. And of course, the guards here kept well away, because word had come, no doubt, from on high to say, do not go near, this is the hot potato issue, do not go near it. And it was done again at the beginning of the repeal campaign. A bunch went up to Belfast to get the abortion pill on prescription, to collect boxes that have been delivered and so on. So I think that these struggles that women have had for, and are going on having for abortion, are really extraordinary. What do you think about the legislation in the UK? I've always thought it's a really, really bad law, which works because people
ignore it.
People ignore it. And what's about that?
I was very surprised when I really looked into it. So abortion's covered by the Offences Against the Person Act 1861,
yes,
which says procuring.
Act that governed us here and women in the North as well.
Yeah, which says it's it's an assault conviction. You're essentially assaulting the fetus. Except so what you do is then you get the 2 doctor exemption. So it's signed off. It says the mother's mental or physical health is at risk, then 2 doctors can sign off an abortion. And the fig leaf of that is the fact that it is always more dangerous to go through pregnancy and birth, which is about one of the most dangerous things you can voluntarily do, than it is to have an early abortion. So it doesn't actually make any sense. I think, it was there in order to kind of put a respectability shield on it, to say the medical establishment, which at the time we read is male, can stop, this isn't abortion on demand. But I think that the worry now is that if you poke about with it, it will become a culture war. It will become another Brexit. And I think I was interested when I was over reporting on the repeal the 8th referendum that, Google and Facebook had been banning outside adverts.
Yes.
And that would be the worry, that you would get into a situation again in which you would have foreign countries piling in money to adverts, turning everything into a binary yes, no. Whereas I think most people's view on abortion is it's sad, they don't want lots of them, but they do understand that there are times when it is the kindest thing to do, and to not ruin a woman's life.
Yes.
And I think that is a reasonable proposition. I'm not an absolutist about this. I think very few people are. And again, one of the great successes I thought of what happened in Ireland was you had a white paper that said, if this gets enacted, this is what you get. It's 12 weeks, essentially abortion on demand. This is not opening the floodgates. Like, you are signing up to a limited, specific liberalisation of the law.
People didn't know what they were getting, but I was, and we fought for that. But I would still say, of course, none of us is getting enough or the right thing. It shouldn't be on the statute books at all, basically. And I think that one of the next fights that we have, certainly in this part of the world, is to get abortion out of the legislature and into the health environment, which is, I think, where it should be. It should never be there at all. But that's my personal kind of a bugbear. I know we're sort of running out of time, which I'm very disappointed about because there's an awful lot I wanted to ask you about. But you were just mentioning there that you are now writing for The Atlantic. And in fact, I'm really enjoying your pieces for that, the Karen, all kinds of interesting things.
Yeah.
But do you think, I mean, I'm going to lump us all together here on the edge of Europe in all kinds of ways and think, you know, are the views very different? Are the challenges very different for feminism and feminists on both either side of the pond?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think that the key thing to understand is that America is a nation obsessed with individual liberty and freedom, and much more. Britain is, you know, it's always the question about how far Britain and to some extent Ireland are between the two poles. You know, we're not fully a Nordic country with a very high social security net, you know, that kind of society, European social democracy, but we're not that American hyper-capitalist, hyper-individualist model yet entirely either. And I think when it comes to feminism, through so many things, you know, the abortion legislation in America is based around privacy grounds. It's done on, you know, that's what Roe versus Wade relies on. And those individualist arguments are ones that, you know, which is why I think that the LGBT movement has had some more success recently in America, because it's about, I should be free to live my life the way I want to. But feminism has a big problem in America because it's about making demands on other people. It's about saying, I can't earn money when I'm breastfeeding a small child. I need the state to pay support to me to that. And then that becomes, well, it's your choice to have children. You chose to do that. And I think that that argument is so much more potent and holds American feminists back, the choice argument. Well, you could have chosen not to do this. You could have chosen, why did you go into a low paying career? Why did you know, all of these things that in Europe, we're so much more used to seeing as a part of an interconnected web of responsibilities to each other. And you see that with things like the mask wearing debate, you know, the fact that really mask compliance is pretty high all across Europe. But America, it's become a massive polarized political issue. You can't tell me to wear a mask. And I think that's a huge challenge for American feminism. And I'm sure as we imbibe through speaking American on the internet, more of that here, it will become a big challenge for British and Irish feminism too.
Oh, I think it is already. Time really is running out. And I did have one last question, which is that, yes, I mean, you finished this book way back when, and that's wonderful to have it out there. But we just had, and we still are having a really awful time with the pandemic. And there has also been the much more, I think, exciting and encouraging occurrence of Black Lives Matter, both in the US, but also in Britain, and also to some extent here in Ireland too. If you were in the middle of writing the book now, or even indeed embarking on it, would something have changed and shifted? There's not much about Black feminism in Britain in the book, for example.
No, there's not. There's a couple, there's some, I talk about race issues as and when they occur, and there's a chapter work that is specifically about the struggle of Ailbhe Desai, who was an immigrant from Gujarati via Tanzania to North London in the 70s, and how she really changed the face of the trade union movement. And the way that women had sort of doubly marginalised, well, not even doubly marginalised, they're marginalised in a unique way by being both an ethnic minority and being women. The reason that there isn't more about Black feminism, I agree, it's an obvious lacuna in the book, is that I never found the struggle, I never found the unique fight to frame it round. And so what's the piece of legislation or the change in attitude that you find for the storytelling bit? And that's my failure as a storyteller, really. But I agree with you. I think that there is a specific tradition of Black British feminism that is incredibly intellectually rich.
But I mean, I kind of grew up with that in probably the late 70s and the 80s when Southall Black Sisters was, and still there with Pragna Patel and the Feminist Review Collective and Brixton Black Women and Gail Lewis and so on, with the result that I think we had something of we definitely had a discourse around intersectionality without using that particular word at that time. And it seems intersectionality now has taken over to be almost used a little bit like a weapon at times, whereas I think there was something potentially more organic, but that maybe the white middle class women's movement failed to really develop, I think.
I think it's annoying when I read the right-wing critiques of intersectionality saying, you know, everybody's kind of awarded privilege points. And I think, well, that is a kind of a fringe. The fundamental theory as articulated by Kimberly Crenshaw is a really good one. So she has this very obvious example about a car plant that employed white women as secretaries, employed black women on the factory floor, but black women didn't get the black men's jobs and they didn't get the white women's jobs. They were discriminated against uniquely as black women, and the fact that they could only sue for sex or race discrimination meant that there was a huge hole in the legislation covering them. It's just a very sensible, clearly articulated point, and I don't know why everyone would kind of feel that this was a, you know, this was a kind of wildly contentious thing to say. But yeah, I agree with you, and I think that it annoys me that has never been articulated, you know, or maybe been allowed to be articulated in a way that has really properly become part of the mainstream feminist movement.
Well, there is so much more to be done, and you know, it is an ongoing process. Finally, your hope for feminism?
My hope for feminism is that we see people who are willing to put their back into it, whether you want to call them leaders or not, and a return to specific policy goals. Because I think ultimately saying, will you be a feminist? Are you a feminist? Is slightly meaningless. We've all got our own individual definition of what it means, but will you support this particular piece of legislation is something that is, you know, is concrete, and it's a demand that you can try and build a coalition behind, even if that coalition otherwise disagrees on a huge amount of other stuff. And that's what feminism, when it has achieved its greatest victories, has managed to do. It's managed to bring people in all their messy, angry glory together for long enough to get something done before usually they splinter off again. And I think rather than, you know, us all being a kind of happy knitting circle where we sit around and talk about our problems, I want to kind of just get stuff done.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I just hope there are going to be lots and lots and lots more fearless feminists out there, not afraid, like the wonderful women in your wonderful book. Thank you so much, Helen. It really has been a delight and an eye-opener to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.